Hi, I'm Dr. Todd Cunningham, a school and clinical child psychologist and one of the psychologists at the Bright Light Psychology Clinic.
And I'm Robin Batcher. I'm an educational consultant who works with the Bright Light Psychology Clinic. Today, we're talking all about psychoeducational assessment or psychological assessments. So, the first question is, what's the difference between the two? Is there a difference?
Great question, Robin. So, psychoeducational assessments really comes out of the history of special education, where early on it was actually special education teachers who were actually working a lot with kids who have learning challenges to try and understand what those issues were. As the field of psychology then was brought into the realm of special education, we kind of moved from just looking at the academics a child was having to really try to understand the cognitive processes behind why a child was having difficulties. And that's where kind of the birth of psychoeducational assessments came. And really, psychoeducational assessments had this, the core components was like the academic challenges, understanding the academic challenges and strengths, but then also trying to understand the cognitive issues that kind of underlie those academic challenges. However, over time, as the field of psychology continued to develop, there was a lot of research that begins to show that though you have these academic weaknesses, they're not always explained by cognitive weaknesses. There's a lot more that can explain why someone's not doing well in school, such as, do I feel very anxious towards my the learning that's going on? Do I have anxiety? And when I have a lot of high anxiety, then when I'm sitting in the class, it's hard for me to pay attention to what the teachers are saying. So I'm not actually learning the information because I'm worried in my I'm caught up in my thoughts, or maybe I'm very depressed, and so I'm again sitting in class and I'm unable to again attend to what's going on because I actually have very low energy in that situation. So there's other factors that start to play out that make it that can impact academics. So really, a psychoeducational assessment kind of began to evolve into a psychological assessment when we brought in really looking at the social emotional aspects around how a child is functioning as well. So today's modern psychological assessment really looks at the academics, the cognitive components, as well as the social emotional issues, and kind of pulls all three of those together to understand the learning profile of a child.
So, on that note, when would you suggest to parents is the best time to seek out a psychological or a psychoeducational assessment?
Whenever there's issues that a child is facing that there's not a good explanation for, or the people who are supporting that child are not, or student are not feeling, don't have a good explanation. And I think as parents, we have this gut react or gut feeling saying, you know what, I've talked with the teachers, I've talked with other people, I still don't think we have an explanation here. And that's when it's time to start to kind of seek out expert help to be able to understand why my child's having difficulties in school or having difficulties in the social emotional area. Our tests are, we can go back to about kindergarten to be able to start to look at the predictors of academic weakness. So we can assess for, we can't diagnose, but we can assess for at risk of developing academic weaknesses in the future. So it's not kind of too early to do that, but definitely when those feelings start to rise, I definitely think something's wrong, then I would definitely recommend to start to seek out and look for an assessment either through the school system or privately. The next time to assess, so once you get your regular assessment, then the question often comes about, when do I reassess, get a reassessment? Now, for the most part, the cognitive profile is going to stay about the same. That doesn't change that much over time. There will be some variability as a child gets older, but for the most part, the weaker areas are going to stay weaker and the stronger areas are going to stay stronger. Academically, your profile will change a lot based on the interventions that you're receiving and the effectiveness of those interventions. So probably throughout a student's you know K to 12 career, you might not need a full psychological assessment done again, but doing some check-ins around the academics is really helpful to make sure that the child is continuing to make the progress that you would expect. Now, If during that K to 12, if you ever feel that there is a real change that has come on, the behaviors have really changed, there's been a significant change in their academic or their emotional performances, then yes, definitely go back and look for a reassessment. An assessment is kind of like snapshot in time. It's like a picture in time of how that child is doing. And so doing that reassessment really can give some clear information if there's a real, again, behavioral or academic or social emotional change that has been observed. The other time that you really have to do an assessment is when you're getting prepared to go off to college or university. Typically, it's about 3 years before the beginning of college and university that you need to get a reassessment done. And that's mostly because we're going to use adult measures at this point to be able to look at, again, their cognitive, academic, and social emotional factors, but using the adult version of our tests.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know a lot of parents often ask, what should they expect when going through a psychological assessment? A lot of times they want to know what it's going to look like, how to prepare their child for it, things like that. So, what would you say to parents with that question?
Well, the psychological assessment really is kind of the development of the manual to how someone goes about learning and thinking and feeling. So I often talk to our clients about, yeah, we're going to write the manual to how your brain is working. And so at the end, we can tell you how we can try and make school a little bit easier for you. And a lot of students like that. They like to know how they go about learning, and they like to know that going through this process, there's going to be a bit of a payoff for them, hopefully, at the end. That something that they see as quite difficult, there will be some strategies and some understanding that's going to help it make it a little bit easier. But the actual process of going through it, often there is an initial consultation meeting where we ask a million and one questions about the history of the individual, right from the pregnancy to birth, all the way up to where they are today, to really understand the history of the development of the child and also the history of the development of the challenges that might be coming up. Then we work one on one with the individual, and we do a bunch of things. We do some school related stuff such as reading, writing, and math. We do language activities. We do puzzles to get at their thinking. And all of these activities we do start off really easy, and they slowly get harder and harder and harder until they get ridiculously hard. What we're doing is we're pushing an individual to their maximum capacity. We're pushing to the maximum capacity so that we can see. And because we're pushing them to their maximum capacity to really see what their ultimate performance is in each of the different areas, it's really important that that individual is well rested, that they had a good night's sleep before, that they had a good breakfast, that they brought some snacks along with them. They got their bottle of water to keep them hydrated. And then as a psychologist, we will kind of watch their engagement level, how they're going, and then take breaks when we need to and stuff like that. But really coming into the assessment with kind of at the optimal level is really important. And at the very, also during the assessment process, often we'll reach out to uh, teachers or other support individuals to kind of understand from their perspective how the individual has been developing. We'll look at any reports that have been developed, report cards to past assessments, notes from doctors. And really, at the end, what we're doing is we're taking all these sorts of information from the history we did, from the interviews from other people, from our testing that we've done, from past reports, and it's all converging together to help us understand what that learning profile is, helping us then write that manual to how that individual goes about learning and thinking and the way that they're feeling. And so at the end, we'll have a feedback where we really communicate that information. And and in our practice, we really feel it's important to be able to not only talk to the parents about the information, but always to talk with the student about that information because it is their lives. And kids know when things are up and hey, they just spent like, 4 to 6 hours with this individual doing all this testing. clearly something's up here. And so we feel it's really important to be able to provide the information, their learning profile to them in appropriate language. And at the very end of that, we provide there's a written report that comes along that kind of summarizes all the information as well with the recommendations. What is next? And so the assessment really is the key to the assessment is this giving you a clear understanding of the learning profile, what the strengths and challenges are, and then a clear understanding of what the next steps are to be able to address those areas of weaknesses so that we can promote that child being more functional, happier.
Yeah, I love the idea of a manual for how a child learns and bringing them into the process so that they understand how their own learning works. And it really probably helps them self advocate, like if I know what I need as a learner and things
Mm-hmm.
are hard for me, maybe not right away, but over time, it gives them the ability to maybe start asking for what they need in school or telling their teachers and things like that. So
Yeah.
I love that piece of it
Yeah.
for helping students build that self advocacy.
Totally. And so Raskin, who's one of these great psychologists down in the US, did this fantastic study that looked at what are the predictive factors of successful LD adults. And there are six he came up with. And the very first one was the ability of self awareness. Do I understand my learning disability? And what made a student, an adult who was successful, who had a learning disability in the area of self awareness, because all the adults understood they had a learning disability, but those who were successful could actually name what specifically their strengths and challenges were, and then what they needed to be able to work around those challenges. And that was different than those who weren't successful. They could say, I had a learning disability or I have these academic weaknesses, but then they couldn't go on to either explain why or stated what they actually needed. So that's why in our practice we see that that is the first step in that development of those critical six skills to be able to be a successful individual.
Yeah, and it sort of leads me, I guess, to my final question, which is the then what after you've got this assessment with recommendations. You know, um, I've read a lot of assessments in my career as a special education consultant, and they can be very lengthy and overwhelming. For parents, also for educators if they're reading them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of information, and I think the real question parents have is then what do I do with this? How do I take this information and help my child with it?
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's a lot of the business that we see at Bright Lights. It's I got the assessment done 2 years ago. I thought everything was going to be great, but we're still at the same point that we are now. And one of the key things about the assessment is it's a manual. So now that we have this manual, is it written in a way that allows to understand what those next steps are? And when it comes to recommendations, we have two typical types of recommendations we'll see. We'll see remediation, which is strengthening underlying skills, and then we see accommodations, which is bypassing or working around an area of weakness when it comes to academics. And so, in that assessment, then really what we're trying to do is develop the balance between remediation and these accommodations so that we can ensure the student can, again, develop the skills that they need, but then also be able to engage in the day to day learning. So that's a key thing. As well as we need to prioritize that. Typically, there's pages and pages of recommendations. There's a lot to be able to do, but you can't do it all at once. And so, really having a kind of a triage. Okay, here's the key things. Tomorrow, these are the two things that you really need to start to focus in on in terms of intervention to be able to support that student. And then after we kind of get going there, then these are the next things we need to bring online, and then the next things that we need to bring online, so that there's a real, again, clear path. And sometimes I think as parents or consumers of psychological reports, we almost need to go back to the psychologist and say, hey, okay, I have all this, but can you please tell me what is that next step? I need to know what that next step is. Otherwise, I am kind of lost in these pages of recommendations. And And having that clear path is really important. It's also really important for the school because again, we can't implement everything at the same time. Having a individual education plan, an IEP with pages of accommodations on it is not very effective because really there's only going to be probably about five key things that are really going to make the difference for that child, and therefore we need to focus on those five key things and not be distracted by those other accommodations. Um, so yeah, really understanding the intervention plan, the balance between remediation and accommodations, as well as have that triage of kind of priority of steps to take next is really important that comes out of that.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, on the school side of things, I have seen lots of individual education plans where every single accommodation under the sun is listed for a child,
Mm-hmm.
and the reality is that it's overwhelming for a teacher too. So it's really important that the psychologist and the parents and the school all work together to really narrow in on what are those key accommodations in the classroom, because otherwise none of them end up getting implemented, which is why you might end up seeing students be
Yeah,
at the same place a year after an assessment because it's too overwhelming to do
yeah.
it all at once. So that's definitely something I've seen.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most about my job is the fact that we hopefully are invited in to be part of that support team. We're not just testing on the side and just kind of providing this report, but really we can enter in and we can connect with the school and the parents and be part of that support student support team meetings to be able to really kind of lay out the plan and hear also what the challenges from the school side is, because I recognize that schools also have limitations in some of the things that they can do, the types of interventions they have, the knowledge that some of their staff have, and so therefore let's work together to be able to kind of develop that plan. And in some cases maybe it is where the parents have to seek outside resources from the school to be able to support their child, because we're not going to be able to get the types of interventions that individual needs through the education system. So it really is about having a very open dialogue, really thinking creatively about how do we get these interventions to the student so that we can best support them.
Yeah, and I think something unique about the Bright Lights experience, like you explained, is that, throughout the whole process and right to the end, helping the family, helping the child work with the school, that's a really special thing. And so I think it's an important part of the process that parents know about, that
Mm-hmm.
they're not just going to get a report and then be left to figure it out, that we support throughout the whole process.
Yeah,
All right, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
great. Have a good day.